We have 4 classes left, counting this one. Today I want to discuss globalization. In the next class, April 3rd, I'm going to discuss the social theoretical presuppositions of this programmatic argument. And in particular, with 2 focal points. One is the nature of regimes and regime change, and the problem of how to deal with the consequences of the absent theory of structure, of structural discontinuity and structural transformation. And the second main theme of that class is then to address the question of agency, how to conceive the agent of these alternatives. And by contrast to the way in which the problem of agency is addressed in the Marxist theory of class conflict. In the next class of April 10th, I want to address the normative assumptions of the argument. So here, the discourse is philosophical rather than social theoretical. And in particular, the idea of freedom that animates all of these programmatic arguments. And that leaves one class at the end, the class of April 17th, which I want to reserve entirely for the discussion that you people bring to the class. And it would be entirely appropriate then also to explore the themes that you're writing about in your final paper. Now with globalization, I want to go in 4 steps. First, I want to present a historical introduction to this topic, because globalization has come twice in the recent history of humanity. And I want to describe the basic characteristics of each of these 2 waves of globalization, of how they resemble each other, and of how they differ. In the second step of the argument, I want to address the present wave and its distinctive characteristics and what makes it troubling, and what the alternatives to its present attributes are, what a different kind of globalization would look like. So the premise of the whole argument about globalization resembles the premise of all the other programmatic arguments in this course, which is that there is no self-evident, single, natural, and necessary form of globalization. Just as there is no single, natural, and necessary form of the market order. Just as we can say of the market order, which market, so we can say of globalization, which globalization. We're not confined to taking more or less globalization. We can ask for a redefinition, for a reconstruction of what globalization has been. And then in the third step of today's argument, I want to turn to the controversial thesis of a supposed trilemma of globalization, which my friend and colleague Daniel Roderick has presented, and explain it and say why I don't agree with it, and what the implications of the agreement or disagreement are for this argument about globalization. And finally, in the 4th step of the argument, I want to broaden out, because up to then, the focus will have been the world trade regime. Globalization focused on trade. But of course, globalization also involves the monetary arrangements of the world, and above all, the arrangements regarding security, war and peace. And say something about that and how that relates to the narrower conception of globalization as being about world trade. So globalization has come twice in the recent history of mankind. It came in the closing decades of the 19th century up to the First World War, especially in the period from 1870 to 1914, the year of the outbreak of the war. Between the wars, in the interwar period, there was a catastrophic shrinkage of globalization. The established form of globalization collapsed, and between the wars, it was not reenacted in some other form. And then after the Second World War, from 1946 to today, and especially picking up in the closing decades of the 20th century, the second major wave of globalization. Now, if we consider these two waves of globalization, the 1870-1914 one and the contemporary one, simply from a quantitative perspective, and ask, when was there more globalization? We can't answer this question in any conclusive way. Gross capital flows, for example, are larger now than they were then in the earlier wave. But net capital flows are smaller. Trade flows as a percentage of GDP have only recently become larger now than they were then. And migratory flows, mass migration, are much, much smaller now than they were then. So there's no simple answer to the question, in which of these two moments of globalization was there more globalization? In some respects, there was more then. In other respects, there's more now. What was similar about these two episodes of globalization? Both of them took place under the aegis of a conception of institutional convergence. The halting convergence of the whole world to the same set of supposedly best institutional arrangements and policies, which in the earlier wave were represented especially by Great Britain and the European countries, and in the second wave, certainly by the United States. The other major similarity of these two waves of globalization is that in both cases, under both waves, the idea of institutional convergence was not just propounded doctrinally. It was enforced by the discipline of capital. In the earlier wave, it was enforced especially by the gold standard. Money was based on gold. It was backed up by gold. And if a country failed to comply with the rules of the world economy, especially the world trading system, gold flowed out, and eventually there would be a balance of payments crisis, which would impede the continuation of its relations with the world economy. Now the gold standard has been abandoned, although in the United States it was definitively abandoned only in the presidency of Richard Nixon. But there is what is in effect a functional alternative to the gold standard. Another way in which the idea of institutional convergence is enforced by the discipline of capital. In the rich countries, the functional equivalent to the gold standard is represented by what is sometimes called sound finance doctrine, represented by the policy paradigm, the inflation targeting regime of the central banks of the world. And this standard of monetary policy is then regarded as indispensable to win financial confidence, the confidence of the capital markets. Without which, supposedly, there will be an economic crisis, a capital strike. Money will flow out, capital will be withdrawn, capital will in effect go on strike. And in the developing countries, another functional alternative to the gold standard. Now, to explain this, let me say that certainly the present form of globalization imposes constraints on all the countries in the world, on all the countries that participate, especially in the world trading system. But these constraints allow of a significant diversity of response. And to see that or show that, it's sufficient to compare the experience of the Northeast Asian countries with the experience of the Latin American countries. Latin America signed on the dotted line. So the Latin American countries were, on the whole, the most subservient to the functional alternative to the gold standard recommended by the academic, economic, and governmental authorities of the North, of the rich countries. And what happened was exactly what you might expect. As I said once earlier in the course, rebellion in historical experience is not always rewarded, but obedience is invariably punished. And sure enough, the Latin American countries, which followed the prescriptions that came from the rich countries, suffered the most calamitous decline in their relative participation in the world economy and world product. By contrast, the Northeast Asian economies were much more successful in dealing with the very same constraints, because after all, it's one world, one set of constraints, but they responded in a completely different way. In general, one can say that the Northeast Asian economies shaped and limited the penetration of the national economy by foreign capital. They dosed it. So they maintained for a very long time severe controls on the inflows and outflows of money, capital controls. Above all, they forced a significant raise in the level of both domestic and public saving, and they insisted on financing national development on the basis of domestic saving rather than on the basis of foreign capital. And finally, they refused to permit the penetration of the national production system of its crucial parts by foreign capital. They emphasized in the early stages of their development strategies a reliance on loan capital, but they avoided risk capital, the buying of their productive assets by foreign capital. And especially what happened in Latin America, which was the acquisition by foreign capital of the intermediate forms of production, that is, the transformative industries, like the industries that make consumer durables, the automotive industry, for example. They refused to allow foreign capital to acquire that. By contrast, the Latin American economies acquiesced in a low level of domestic saving, both public and private, and funded their national development on the basis of foreign capital. And they permitted the penetration, the early penetration of the national production system by foreign capital. So these were countries in Northeast Asia, the Asian tiger economies, first Japan, starting in the 19th century, then the Northeast Asian tiger economies, especially South Korea and Taiwan, and finally China, communist China. Now, this diversity of the Latin American and the Northeast Asian responses to the same constraints of globalization can be seen from two angles. On the one hand, it demonstrates that despite the tendency in national politics in all these countries to claim that there's no alternative, that globalization requires it, this or that, that if you don't do what the rich countries recommend or demand, there'll be an economic calamity. The Northeast Asian countries showed the opposite. What they showed is that the religion of financial orthodoxy, the genuflection to the doctrine recommended by the capital markets, appears to be necessary only in the very short run, because in the medium to the long term, the only thing that counts are the results, the actual reality of economic growth and the opportunities for profit that it generates. So China, which defied all the orthodoxy of the capital markets, which did everything against the principles of financial rectitude, in a very short time became the main destination of foreign risk capital in the world, illustrating, as if it needed any demonstration, that what counts is the reality and not the religion. And it's salutary then to remember this, because throughout the world, globalization is claimed to be a prison, a cage, which requires national governments to do this or that. And it does have, as later parts of today's argument will show, particular consequences and real constraints. But nevertheless, within those same constraints, there's a huge room for maneuver, as the difference between the Asian and Latin American experience demonstrates. Now, the second angle from which to appreciate the significance of this diversity of response, Asiatic and Latin American, has to do with domestic economic policy. So in general in the world, when the leftists abandoned their faith in Marxism, avowedly or implicitly, they converted to Keynesianism and to what you might call vulgar Keynesianism, with the belief that economic growth can be engineered or propped up by counter-cyclical economic policy, fiscal and monetary policy. That, as it were, as the conservatives say, you can spend your way into economic growth. Now, there's a basis for this in Keynes's original doctrine. Because Keynes taught that the level of saving and of investment is much more the consequence of growth than the cause or condition of growth. And this idea then is carried to its radical conclusions in so-called modern monetary theory, which teaches that with respect at least to the management of the internal debt, the state can solve all its fiscal limitations by simply making more money, since after all the internal debt is debt that the country owes to itself in its own currency. Now, what is the problem with this Keynesian, I want to say, illusion? The problem is that it doesn't take into account the strategic imperative of rebellion, of heresy, in the early stages of a process of national development. In the early stages of a process of national development, it may be necessary to impose a very high level of domestic saving, public and private, even mandatory saving, at great sacrifice, to balance the books, to generate a fiscal surplus, to create huge national reserves in hard currency. It may be necessary to do all of this, not in order to win the confidence of the financial markets, which is the theory of the pseudo-orthodoxy of finance, but for exactly the opposite reason, so that the country and its government not be on their knees before the financial markets. In other words, superficially it's the same thing, but functionally it's for the opposite reason, and the difference of the reason becomes manifest in the following steps of the trajectory of national development. It may be necessary then to subordinate the appeal, the seduction of the Keynesian spending policies, of the Keynesian fiscal and monetary policies, in order to affirm the strategic imperative of raising a fiscal shield for national rebellion. If the government is to have an insubordinate, a heretical strategy of national development, as the Northeast Asian countries did, it has to be able to say no. It has to have what I'm just calling a large shield in order to be able to insist on its heresy, in order to be able to deviate. So this is all by way of illustrating the content of the second similarity of the two episodes of globalization, which is that they both had a doctrine of convergence, and in both cases, convergence was enforced by the discipline of capital. But the complication is the one that I've just illustrated. Even within the constraints of this form of globalization, of both forms, the form then and the form now, there was a large room for maneuver. And the possibility of deviation, of resistance, and of rebellion could be enhanced by a certain syndrome of economic policies. The Latin American countries, on the whole, followed a functional equivalent to the gold standard, which were the policies I just enumerated: low level of domestic saving, reliance on foreign capital, permission to foreign capital to penetrate the national production system. The Asian economies did the opposite. And because they did the opposite, they were able, in a higher degree, to resist the idea of convergence and to follow their own imperatives, their own conception of national development. Now, before I go on to explore the differences between these two waves of globalization, let me ask whether anyone has a question or an observation about these controversial remarks that I've just made. Yes?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand what it means to have a sort of a fiscal shield. Is that saying that you have a failing industry in your country, you're then able to inject it with capital as opposed to looking to...
That would probably be a bad bet. If then you have to enter into the details. That doesn't mean that you're free to bet on whatever you want. You have to make the right bet still, right? So if, for example, you have a conventional industry, the counterpart to what in the United States is called a Rust Belt industry, and you simply try and prop it up a few more years, right, to subsidize it,
Sure.
That's likely to be a bad bet. So that's not what it means. What it means is that if you have a slump, a recession in your country, the progressives in your country are likely to say, we can spend our way out of it by counter-cyclical Keynesian policy. And if you have a strategic idea of national development, you'll say, no, wait, because the short-term attractions of the counter-cyclical management of the economy, of the demand pumping, of the propping up, will be counterbalanced by the higher strategic imperatives of raising this fiscal shield over national development. If you want to have a heretical productivist project in your country, like a project of converting the Rust Belt industries into variants of the knowledge economy, and forcing a technological evolution, you have to be sure that it won't be broken in its early stages, in its infantile stages, by the power of foreign capital. And that's then the fiscal shield.
You're using those fiscal reserves to come in and...
That's right. You're using the fiscal reserves as what allows the state in the early stages of a rebellious development strategy to say no. That's the question. Because you have an alternative, you have your own war chest, you have your foreign currency reserves. Now, reserves in a hard currency are very expensive. They're expensive to maintain, so they impose a national sacrifice. Now, then you say a fiscal surplus, so-called primary surplus in the budget. It's the budget minus what you owe on the internal debt. Generating a fiscal surplus, that's also expensive. Imposing a high level of saving even mandatory, as for example it was in Singapore, to achieve vast rates of saving. In some of these Asian economies, the rate of saving was over 40%. So all of these things impose sacrifice. So this, in a way, is an expression of the idea of a war economy without a war, to which I've alluded in earlier moments in the course. So it's not easy. It's not just a rhetorical alternative. It's an alternative that imposes sacrifices. It requires a strong political formation to be able to impose these sacrifices, to demand it from the people. But this is in return for the possibility of having a rebellious strategy of national development. Any other comment or question about this? So this particular topic, which I have introduced en passant, is a major topic of debate in the developing world. Because, as I said, if you're not a Marxist in the developing world, you're likely to be some kind of Keynesian and to be attracted to this idea. And what is now in the rich world labeled modern monetary theory will be like a mirage, right? Very difficult to resist. So that's the reality now of the debate about economic policy in the world. And the claim that I'm making is the claim that a productivist project is much more important than short-term credit-fueled or demand-fueled economic growth. That what you want is a form of growth that can be sustained and that takes a definite institutional form that is antagonistic to the form that is recommended from the North. And you have to be able to sustain that against resistance, against opposition. That's the content of this debate. Now, yes?
Just had a question about the Northeast Asia exception.
Yes.
In the sense that, like, to what extent it's replicable? Because I'm thinking about the fact that this region also benefited from, like, the Japanese model.
Well, the Japanese comes from the 19th century, of course,
Yeah,
so
but
it's
like,
out
I'm
of
just
this.
thinking, like, more after the Second World War, like,
Yes.
with these kind of tigers, this was also in a way funded by the U.S., like, in, like, kind of through, like, U.S. capital that came through Reconstruction. So I'm wondering, kind of, this is not something that...
Well, that's a complication, yes, that's true. So, for example, Taiwan now produces a large part of, actually manufactures a large part of the semiconductors needed in the world. But the origins of the Taiwanese semiconductor industry lie in the transfer of American technology at the end of the Second World War. RCA, in particular, gave these early Taiwanese companies the intellectual property they needed to develop their semiconductor industry. So you're right. That's a complication in this argument. So it's not just that they didn't just encounter resistance. They did have a powerful ally at a crucial moment. And that is part of the narrative, yes. Yes.
Yeah, so I understand your argument that the government should pick a few industries that are promising, make the right bet.
Speak
So
louder.
the government should find the most promising industries and invest in these productivists.
No, I didn't actually say that.
How do we make the right bet?
Yeah, I didn't actually say that. So, because now we're approaching indirectly the discussion of industrial policy. So I'm not recommending in this argument industrial policy in its conventional form, because in its conventional form the objection to it is picking winners, right? And then the conservatives say, with some justification, when the state picks winners, the losers will end up picking the state. Huh? So then there's this alliance between sectarian and corporate interests and their subsidy. I prefer, in general, a method which is agnostic about sectors, but very aggressive about institutions or framework. So there should be a productive lift up, but the net should be cast very widely, rather than a narrow choice of particular sectors on the assumption that they are the sectors of the future. We ask which are the future-oriented sectors. The answer is, it's the future that chooses them, not us. And so we should insist on a wide experimental openness to this question of the particular sectors. Thus the argument for agnosticism about the sectors.
And the funds come after the saving, or the saving?
No, what's saying is that the financing of this rebellious strategy of development should, in the early stages of the process of development, be, to the extent possible, internally financed. And it's not then that there is a prejudice against foreign capital. The statement is that if there is a domestic cycle, a virtuous cycle of saving, investment, and entrepreneurship, then foreign capital becomes much less dangerous. What can't be allowed is for foreign capital to gain early control of the crucial strategic sectors of the production system. That's the argument. And in a way, it's tangential to this discussion about globalization, but it seemed to me to be a necessary refinement of the argument. Now, in other respects, these two waves of globalization were very different. And here are three ways of understanding how they differed. The late 19th century wave of globalization and the present wave. The first is the fundamental basis of global trade, of world trade, has become different. The premise of the classical theory of trade on the basis of Ricardian comparative advantage was that trade happened basically as an exchange between the central rich economies that were rich in capital and the peripheral developing economies that were rich in labor. That was the basis of trade. Now we have a different situation in the world because the new vanguard of production is established in all the major economies of the world. Not just in the United States, Japan, Germany, but also in China and India. And you could even say that the commanding force of the world economy now is the network of these advanced sectors, subject now to the decoupling which is taking place between the American and the Chinese economies. And that's a different basis for world trade. Trade is no longer the simple exchange between capital-rich and labor-intensive economies. The second major difference between the two waves of globalization is that there was massive migration, mass migration in the first wave, but there still isn't in the second wave. Now, this is a theme of very great significance to the world. And why? Because if you ask, what are the main influences now, not on inequality within countries, but on inequality among countries, there is one factor that overshadows every other factor. and that is labor mobility. Labor mobility is much, much more important in its causal influence on inequalities among countries than anything else. And this was demonstrated in the earlier episode of globalization, when there was mass migration, and it had precisely this equalizing effect. Now, of course, the equalizing effect is subject to a powerful restraint, because the instantaneous adoption of universal labor mobility in today's world would be revolutionary. It would create revolution, it would evoke revolution everywhere in the world, in the sending countries and in the receiving countries. So the only way in which it could advance would be if it advanced with safeguards on both sides. That is, the sending countries, the countries that send workers, would have to receive compensations for their investment in human capital and the formation of people. And the receiving countries would have to have safeguards which transform the process into a stepwise, gradual one, from temporary work permits to temporary residency, legal residency, and full citizenship only at the end. Otherwise, it would be intolerable, and it would be a revolutionary shock. Nevertheless, the question is, what's the direction? And we're going to come back to that a little later. Now, the third way in which these two episodes of globalization differed is that the idea of convergence is not now, in the second wave, just a general tendency or an assumption. It is codified. It takes a canonical form in the doctrines of the economists and in the rules and policies of the multilateral organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. It's codified. It has a canonical form, and in this canonical form it has labels like the Washington Consensus or the Augmented Washington Consensus. And just as the idea of convergence is now codified and canonical, so too the resistance to it is much more ferocious and articulated in contrary doctrines to the doctrines of the Washington Consensus or its equivalents. So that's an elementary introduction to the historical appearance of globalization in recent history in these two ways. And all by itself, it already demonstrates that globalization isn't one thing. That the question with globalization is always, which globalization? Now, shall I go ahead, or does someone would like to explore some aspect of it? So the next step is then to ask, what then is the peculiar character of the present wave? What is it that distinguishes the present wave of globalization as an idea and as a practice? And how can one contrast each of its defining attributes to the attributes of a different form of globalization, a form that we might have reason to prefer? So the first attribute is the conception of the goal. And I'm going to illustrate this comparison of the present form of globalization to another speculative alternative by taking as the context world trade, the regime of world trade, because the regime of world trade illustrates most clearly what is at stake in these alternative forms of globalization. So the present regime of world trade, by the present regime, I mean the regime organized under the WTO treaties and under the subsequent multilateral arrangements or efforts to create arrangements like the Trans-Pacific or the Transatlantic, and which are, as a practical matter, much more important now than the WTO, which has been relatively hollowed out. So the first is, what's the goal? The goal is the maximization of free trade, meaning not just trade in goods and services, but also the free flow of capital. The more the better seems to be the assumption. And what would be the alternative to this assumption of an alternative idea of globalization? The alternative would be the notion that free trade is a means to an end, but not the goal. The goal is the coexistence of alternative strategies of national development and alternative experiences of civilization within a world economy that gradually becomes more open. That would be a different definition, a different understanding of what globalization is for. And on this second view of the goal of globalization, you could say free trade is never an end in itself. It's sometimes good, it's sometimes bad. The movement of things and of money across national frontiers is sometimes useful and sometimes harmful. By contrast to, say, the movement of people, which is sacrosanct, because it's part of the process by which humanity becomes both unified and diverse. Now, the second attribute of this present form of globalization is that it takes place under the aegis of what you could call institutional and legal maximalism, meaning the following. The countries that participate in the world trade system under the aegis of this form of globalization are expected to adhere not just to the market economy in the abstract, but to a very particular version of the market economy, which excludes many of the experiments in the institutional reconstruction of a market economy, which we've been discussing in this course. Experiments in the way of shaping the relation between the vanguard of production and the rest of the production system. Experiments in shaping the relation of labor to capital, and experiments in shaping the relation of finance to the real economy or to production. Institutional maximalism. So, for example, under this regime of globalization, all of the partnerships or associations between government and private business, which the countries that are now rich used in order to become rich, must be denied to the latecomers under the label subsidies. Or to take a second example, the odious regime of intellectual property, which was developed relatively late at the end of the 19th century, the patent system, the system of copyright and trademarks, and which has the consequence of leaving many of the technological innovations of greatest value to humanity, like the medical or pharmaceutical innovations, in the control of a handful of private multinational businesses must be incorporated into the regime of world trade. That's another expression of this maximalist idea. Now, what's the alternative to institutional and legal maximalism? It's very simple. The alternative is minimalism. That is, the greatest openness possible on the basis of the minimum of restraint on the power to experiment with the institutional arrangements of the market economy in all of these domains that we've been discussing in the course. Now, we know that this institutional minimalism is possible. And we know it for a very simple reason, that it is precisely the characteristic of the commercial regime that immediately preceded the regime of the WTO, the regime of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is the label of the World Trade Regime that immediately preceded the WTO, was characterized by this legal and institutional minimalism. It had, so that the WTO and the subsequent multilateral treaties represented a revolution in the legal and institutional architecture of the World Trade Regime. But there's a more fundamental historical basis for this idea that there's a minimalist alternative to the maximalist principle. And the more powerful historical basis is the experience of the law merchant, international commercial law, for centuries in creating a law of international transactions and arrangements that took into account the diversity of the underlying jurisdictions. So, for example, if the Hanseatic League in the Baltic Sea traded with the Russian Empire, the reason for trade was that they were different. That's the whole reason. And the legal problem then, the problem that the international jurists confronted, was how could they create a law of international transactions that could be superimposed on the diversity of domestic law? And of course there are limits, there's a tension, but this tension could be managed. And it was managed, and that was the whole nature of the international commercial law. Now this practical issue is connected with a theoretical problem that came up earlier in the course, and I'm going to return to next week, once again in the discussion of economics. The economics created by marginalism at the end of the 19th century, which is, after all, the dominant economic theory, the paradigm, which to this day shapes the evolution of economics, has no reason to give any properly economic weight to the diversity of economic institutions and rules in the world. Because for this economics, they appear as merely a source of transaction costs, of failures of harmonization. From the standpoint of this pure economics, it might be better if there were a single state, a world state, with one set of rules. And if there have to be a diversity of states, the more they can harmonize or converge to the same rules, the better. But of course, this is a theoretical failure, a failure in economic theory, and not just a practical problem. And because one of the defects of this economic theory, the theory created by marginalism, is that it's like half of a theory of competitive selection. Remember, when we discussed this earlier, I compared it to the neo-Darwinian synthesis in the life sciences. There is a theory of competitive selection. It's the Darwinian theory of natural evolution. And there's a theory of the creation of the diverse stuff from which competitive selection selects. And that's the theory of genetic mutation and recombination. So the fecundity of a process of competitive selection is entirely dependent on the richness of the material from which it selects. But where's the theory of the creation of the diverse stuff? One of the bases of the creation of diverse stuff is the division of humanity into sovereign states with different institutions and different laws. That's why there is the diversity. So Immanuel Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, makes the following remark in an entirely different context. He says, the dove flying in the air thinks that if there were no air, it would fly even faster. And so it's the same thing. It's the same idea that diversity is just a problem. Diversity is the condition of the result that we seek. And the more diversity in principle, the better. So the question of what's the limit of diversity beyond which we cannot, as a practical matter, transact, exchange among ourselves, and develop a law to organize this transaction, this exchange, among jurisdictions that follow different rules, is an empirical question. We can't a priori determine that. That's what the jurists are good at working at. That's what they've done over several centuries. So this is all by way of affirming the thesis that the underlying diversity is a condition of economic progress. And we shouldn't then traduce it or suppress it through a dogmatic and all-inclusive idea of transactions costs. The practical consequence of which would be the less diversity, the better. So this present form of globalization is organized on the principle of institutional and legal maximalism, which there is reason to challenge, as I just did. Now comes a third attribute of the present form of globalization, illustrated in the commercial realm, in the realm of world trade. Its spirit is to give goods, services, and money the greatest possible freedom to cross national frontiers. As I said in describing the first attribute, the more the better. But to arrest, to imprison people in the nation state, or in blocks of relatively homogeneous nation states like the European Union. There's no basis in either economic theory or in the political theory of democracy for this radical contrast between the treatment of things and of money and the treatment of people. You could say the opposite. The treatment of things and of money could be useful or harmful, but the mobility of people is sacrosanct and has a much higher attraction. But the fact is that this present form of globalization is all oriented to diminish the freedom of people and to radicalize the freedom of things and of money. Now, of course, as I said a moment ago when we were discussing this, labor mobility cannot be adopted instantaneously and universally and radically. because it would be a revolutionary and subversive principle anywhere in the world. But the question is the direction. And there is an alternative to this idea. The alternative is the simple, practical notion that things, money, and people should win freedom together in little cumulative steps. And we should not have a system that gives all freedom to things and to money and no freedom to people to cross national frontiers. So those are three distinctive attributes of the division, of the difference, of the distinctive character of this present form of globalization. It very clearly illustrates how it's different, not just from the earlier wave of globalization, but from a regime that we might have reason to develop today as part of a progressive alternative now understood globally. Is that clear? Are those contrasts clear? I understand that every part of that is subject to controversy, to debate. But this is by way of developing the content of the thesis that the issue is not how much globalization, but which globalization. Now, let me come to the third step of the discussion I had in mind for today, which is to take up Roderick's thesis of a trilemma of globalization in order to illustrate some of these alternatives. So Roderick says, hyperglobalization, radical convergence, democratic mass politics, and national sovereignty. You can have only two of the three. You can have any two of the three, but you can never have three of the three. That's the thesis of the trilemma of globalization. So, for example, you have hyperglobalization and national sovereignty. That is, a sovereign national economic policy. If you adhere to what was called the golden straitjacket. The golden straitjacket is the functional alternative to the gold standard that I was describing before. Sound finance doctrine, or its equivalent in the developing countries, which is reliance on a low level of saving, therefore reliance on foreign capital to replace domestic saving. That's the basis for the financing of development. Permission of flows of money in and out, opening of the capital account, and preservation of a high fiscal surplus and so forth. To have hyperglobalization with democratic mass politics, you have to move to a world state in a federal or confederal form at least. So that's world federalism as the basis for the reconciliation. And to have national sovereignty in economic policy with democratic mass politics, you have to have the Bretton Woods Compromise, especially in the form that Keynes originally proposed. Fixed exchange rates, capital controls. So you have this system which does limit at the outside domestic economic policy, but leaves a large space for variation and is compatible with democracy. Now, what does hyperglobalization mean? Because that's an essential element in the trilemma. Hyperglobalization is the idealized extension of a tendency to convergence, to the same set of institutions and practice. It's the imaginary extension of that tendency to its outer limit. On the assumption that all diversity is trouble, transactions costs, lack of harmony. The European Union is a practical example of this idea in a particular regional form. Now, what do I say? I say this trilemma must be false. And now I'm going to give the argument for why it's false. It can't be true if by hyperglobalization we mean the tendency to convergence, rather than its unreal, radical enactment. That's what hyperglobalization must mean. Because if we imagine the idealized extension of globalization in a world in which there's no diversity left, the sovereign states of the world are a pale shadow of their former selves, because they really all administer the same laws, the same rules, and they have the same institutions. So why do they exist? What's the point? The point of the sovereign states is, in principle, to be experiments in different forms of humanity, different forms of life, different ways of organizing society. If they're not that, what are they? So, hyperglobalization must mean just this tendency to convergence, not the radical speculative extension. But if it's just the tendency, on the basis of what we have, which are a world with few strong national projects. What are strong national projects? They're projects that involve massive mobilization of resources to the end of creating institutions that are different, that are unique. Those, like in the conception of a war economy without a war. This is a world in which there's national sovereignty, but without an abundance of strong national projects. And democratic mass politics. What kind of democracy actually exists in the world? The weak, flawed democracies that don't have the attributes of what I call the high-energy democracy, with high levels of popular engagement in political life, rapid resolution of impasse, combination of strong initiative by central government with radical devolution. So what do we have? We have the tendency to globalization, not the idealized radical extension. We have the sovereign states characteristically without strong national projects, and we have these flawed, weak democracies, or the alternative to them, which is authoritarian state leadership. Not high-energy democracy. And they're not incompatible, and the proof that they're not incompatible is very simple. The proof that they're not incompatible is that right now they are compatible, because that's what we have in the world. What we have in the world is this combination of a tendency to convergence, sovereign states without strong national projects, and this contained relatively weak democracies. it can't be that the three elements of the trilemma are incompatible, because they are compatible right now. They coexist. Their coexistence is what defines the world situation. And they coexist on the basis of a form of globalization characterized by what a moment ago I called institutional maximalism, institutional and legal maximalism. Now imagine that we did have states in the world, many states in the world, with strong national projects. Massive resource mobilization, use of these resources to support heretical trajectories of national development. And imagine that we had high energy democracies. Then the present form of globalization based on this institutional maximalism would be overthrown because these strong states would not tolerate it. And they would impose, they would require a different kind of globalization characterized by legal and institutional minimalism. That is, exchange among the countries of the world, but with the greatest openness to institutional experiments, including experiments in the way of organizing the market order. A high energy democracy and strong states with strong national projects, by definition, are incompatible with institutional maximalism and globalization. And so this would be a different form of globalization in which hyperglobalization as institutional maximalism would be replaced by globalization as institutional minimalism. We have these strong national projects, and we have a high energy democracies in the world. And then the three elements of the trilemma would also coexist, but they would coexist in a different way on a different basis. So the trilemma would be false in the existing world, or they would be false, or it would be false in this alternative world. In both worlds, in the world that exists and in the world that we might have reason to establish, the trilemma would be false. So the trilemma is false. There is no trilemma. That's the argument. Now, any comment? So this isn't a shell game, a game about words. This is about matters of great importance to humanity. What this argument especially illustrates is that there's a relation, a dialectical relation between the form of globalization and the ambition of national politics. So how would this form of globalization that I described at the second step of my argument be overthrown? So you could say, states would arise in the world that would have strong national projects. Or democracies that would be high energy democracy. And then they would confront the limits of the present form of globalization. Because although it allows a significant room for maneuver, as the contrast between Northeast Asia and Latin America illustrates, it does impose constraints. And so these these high energy democracies or these powerful states with these strong development projects would hit against the limits imposed by the present form of globalization. They would ally among themselves in order to force a change. And they would create a different form of globalization based on institutional and legal minimalism, not the present form, which is based on institutional and legal maximalism. And that change in the form of globalization would in turn permit these strong national projects to advance further. So in other words, the initial steps, the first and crucial steps in the movement can't come from on top. So the change in the character of globalization is obviously never going to happen as the gift of a cosmopolitan technocratic elite to humanity. That's not how it can happen. Because the cosmopolitan technocratic elite is an instrument of the problem. The present form of globalization is a characteristic product of the cosmopolitan technocratic elite, which is wedded to this institutional and legal maximalism as one of its main instruments for achieving a dictatorship of the law, as the Russians say, over humanity. So the movement has to come from below, from national rebellion. And national rebellion then is the first step in the breaking of the cage, of the prison of the present form of globalization. Now you're all silent, no one says anything. So I think that the debates within the European Union are in some sense a preview of these debates. Yes?
Quick question. The cosmopolitan technocratic elite, do you see there as being significant crossover with the other population that's a part of the knowledge frontier, or do you see them as distinct groups?
The crossover with the second element, I don't understand. You say with the elite that controls the knowledge economy, is that what you mean?
That's right, yeah.
I don't know. Could be, but why? Do you think there is? Do you think they're the same people? Seems to me that they're a different group. The elite that controls the knowledge economy is on the whole in most countries a national elite, right? And it's in an insular position, but its perspective is the perspective of the nation. So most of humanity is hostile to the soft globalism of this technocratic elite. This subject which come up in the next stage of discussion. Humanity doesn't want a world state. And everyone who writes about global governance, world institutions, is more or less suspect of being overtly or covertly sympathetic to this soft globalism. So what is the substance of the soft globalism? The soft globalism is we should all understand one another on the basis of these common arrangements. The nations can still be different from one another as a matter of folklore. So they have different customs, different habits, social and culinary and so forth. But this is a curiosity, right? And they converge in what matters. That's the soft globalism. And everyone who deals with the subject matter. So one of the strange things about discussing this is that there's almost no one who deals with globalization and the world trading regime who is not a soft globalist of one kind or another. So they are in general, in the world, I think, a despised minority. And I, in this debate, for once I think I have the majority on my side, the majority of humanity that doesn't want this. We want something else. Yes.
I have a question about, I guess how you define hyperglobalization and the current form versus what a new form would look like, that is defined by legal and institutional minimalism versus maximalism.
Yes.
I think I'm having trouble because I would argue that the current form, at least in terms of legal and institutional maximalism, isn't enforced equally. I'd say like hyperglobalization currently could be defined in other forms in terms of like interconnectedness, but like the legal and institutional mechanisms, I don't think are maximalist, at least on like an equal scale. Maybe there are, like trade embargoes, but I don't think like countries or globally equally, there's sort of this legal and institutional maximalism. And outside of the financing structure for international development, and let's say, I don't know, the IMF and like World Bank disappearing, what are the other examples of this sort of legal and institutional maximalism becoming minimalistic? Like I don't see that sort of transition.
I think it's the idea that it's a tendency which the concept of hyperglobalization anticipates to insist of similarity in the substantive law. So I gave two examples. I gave the example of the intellectual property regime, and I gave the example of the concept of subsidies. So take the concept of subsidies. Every developing country in the world, beginning with Britain in the 18th century, based its national development on these deals between the state and part of the entrepreneurial elite. It's the basis of development of the British Empire. The Americans did this throughout their history. The technical name for that in the present literature is subsidies. That's outlawed. But that was the basis of the development of every country that has developed in the world. That's the problem. And so, and I think that you can imagine the extension of these tendencies. So what's the next step? The next step is to incorporate into the rules of world trade flexibility in the labor market. Like the Hartz reforms in Germany, which say, you can't tenure workers because that's in a way the subsidy of a set of economic agents. So to really be a market, you have to be a market like we think a market has to be. That would be the direction that hyperglobalization would take. So more and more compression or suppression of possible deviations in the way of organizing a market economy. And not to mention my radical speculative experiments. I mean, take the idea of saying no one has permanent control of capital. The means of production are vested in funds which conduct a rotating capital auction. What about that? That's total anathema. So in other words, the whole experimental reconstruction of a market economy is being denied. But what does that have to do with trade? So that's this false idea that there has to be some template, some paradigm of a market economy which is the basis for change, as opposed to the idea that trade will be valuable the more different we are in the way we organize, not just in the things we produce, but in how we're organized. Then that's what will really be valuable. Exchange among the different, not exchange among the similar. And that's really the ultimate social basis of Ricardian comparative advantage. I'm different from you. It's not just I'm a version of you, and by accident I make cars instead of refrigerators. I organize myself differently. And that allows me then to have a different kind of comparative advantage from the kind that is imaginable in a different culture and a different society. So I think, so that is then sort of the bridge to this last theme that I want to take up, which is the relation of this discussion of the world trade regime and its transformation to diversity in humanity, and expressed not just in trade, but in war and peace. So of course there's also a debate about the monetary arrangements of the world, but it's rather simple. The general desire in the world is that the dollar should cease to be the reserve currency of the world. The Americans ferociously resist that, although the use of the dollar as a reserve currency, I think, has certain disadvantages for the United States as well as advantages. But the BRICS countries are now determined to replace the dollar. And there's an intermediate stage in which they will trade directly among themselves in their national currencies, circumventing the dollar. And they imagine that as a step toward the complete replacement of the dollar. Now, what about the fundamental questions of war and peace? So, and placing this in a larger context of international arrangements and understanding of globalization. So there are an indefinite number of schemes now for the organization of the world. And this globalist intellectual elite or technocracy is always imagining ways to fix the world by international arrangements. But if you look at practical experience, as opposed to the things that this globalist elite writes, there's actually only one thing that works. There isn't an abundance of alternatives. The only thing that works is cooperative initiative, cooperation among the sovereign states to avert global harms or to produce global public goods through cooperation, through what you could call coalitions of the willing. That's the only thing that works by way of global governance. And what are the forms of this coalitions of the willing? So there are similar state coalitions, states that have similar functions in the international order, like the G20 or the G7. Second, there are regional coalitions like the European Union or the African Union. And third, there are special purpose coalitions to resolve a particular problem. For example, a special purpose coalition might be to organize the steps for the exploration of the use of solar energy in the future. Now, then there's the United Nations system. created in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. It doesn't work. So it has two main vehicles: the General Assembly, which is a debating club based on the juridical fantasy that these pseudo-states, tiny states, are states just like the Soviet Union or the United States, right? Westphalian pretense. And the Security Council, which is the instrument by which it's supposed that we will shape war and peace, and which is paralyzed by the vetoes of the 5 putative victors of a war that ended 75 years ago. So in what respect does the United Nations work? When it works, where it works, is not in these major activities. It works as an umbrella organization that then serves as a basis for solving a particular functional problem on the basis of cooperation of sovereign states, like the climate problem. So it's an umbrella organization for the Conference of Party Agreements that resulted in the Paris Agreement of 2016, the Glasgow Agreement of 2021. That's how it works. So what works are these coalitions of the willing, and I think what are especially promising are the special purpose coalitions. That's the only thing that works. And these coalitions then produce what you could call proto-law, because their activities then result in a legacy, and the legacy is then kind of the contractual or post-contractual construction of a set of arrangements which after the fact can be codified or canonized as part of the material that goes into the development, the evolution of international common law. So the Security Council, what happens? If the United States and its allies seek redress for an issue that they judge of vital significance to them, they then pump up the Security Council like a balloon that they fill with air. And if it doesn't work, then they empty it of air and they organize outside the Security Council a coalition to go to war, to have some expeditionary force. So it'd be necessary, and there were two things that did work in modern history. One was Bismarck's Concert of Europe in the 19th century to establish an entente among the middle-level powers that was based on the idea that no country should be faced with a choice between surrender and war, and that you have to preserve a multiplicity of powers in the world and not present any country with a diktat from which it cannot escape. And the other was the League of Nations, which had a much more practical and limited focus than the United Nations. It was focused on the territorial integrity and preservation of the sovereignty of the states, and it was somewhat similar to the Concert of Europe. So through the cooperative activity of the states, they would have to organize themselves. And one of the forms of organization would be to identify the vital security interests of the major powers and of the lesser powers, and to work in developing a system of mutual guarantees that would lessen the risk of war, because the world is now sliding toward war. And that's the background of all of this discussion of diversity. Institutional minimalism and institutional maximalism. So, for example, in the climate question, why are they discussing only the negative, that is, the organization of emissions, of carbon? Why aren't they discussing the alternative energy regime in the world? So suppose there's an agreement that the most promising basis of energy is hydrogen, green hydrogen, which in turn requires the development of copper, because of the work through the machines, copper-based machines. Then they have to organize the international copper market. So there isn't even that. There's just a discussion of these limits of the negative externalities that they generate. There isn't convergence on the organization of the regime, of the alternative energy regime. So what would be the alternative? The alternative is the world trade regime transformed based on institutional minimalism, reconciled with the creation of transformative variation in the world, and the multiplication of these coalitions of the willing of cooperation among states to generate international public goods or to avoid global public harms through cooperative action, including in the questions of war and peace, through a system of mutual reassurance, patient diplomatic work, in the development of understandings among the sovereign states. And what's the basis of the idea of the nation, of all of this? The idea is humanity develops its powers and possibilities only by developing them in different directions. The role of the national difference in the world is to be a form of moral specialization within humanity. There's no natural way of organizing a society or being a human being. So this relates to the earlier discussion about the change in the character of the national difference. The nations of the world used to be like tribes based on common descent and homogeneity. So there's a tangible, porous set of customs, and to be part of a collective identity of a nation was to live according to those customs. So to be a Roman was to live according to the customs of the Romans and so forth. Then, in the course of history, the character of the national difference changes. And now there's the idea of national difference, of national distinction, but it's emptied out of concrete content. Because in order to prosper in this worldwide ideological and practical emulation, this competition, the nations of the world have to imitate one another. They have to scour the world to discover what works. They have to tear out parts of themselves and adapt things from abroad. So the tangible collective identity is eviscerated, it's hollowed out. And what survives instead is the will to difference, the will to national sovereignty in the presence of the waning of actual difference. And that leads to the idea that I suggested to you in an earlier class of the poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. Two nations live side by side and they come to hate each other, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike. And they have this impotent rage to difference. They want to be different. So the will to difference can only be the object of an intransigent faith. It has no tangible content. The tangible customary content is always porous and susceptible of mixture. But the will to national difference is incapable of compromise. So then we have this situation in the world in which faced with this characteristic, this evisceration of tangible collective identity, there are three positions. The position of reactionary nationalism is restore the ancient differences, the customs, our different way of being human. The position of liberal cosmopolitanism is suppress difference and converge to the same set of practices and institutions. The democratic and experimentalist third position would be equip difference. Give the nations of the world the instruments with which to create difference, real difference. Real difference, because it's concrete, is capable of combination, it's porous. The abstract will to difference is not capable of compromise. Difference is not the problem, difference is the solution. And this argument about the trilemma of globalization, international organization of humanity, is simply one more tangible expression of the same idea. The nations of the world should be given the equipment, the instruments, cultural and institutional, with which to diverge, to create different forms of humanity. And that real difference then is not the reason for antagonism. It's on the contrary what allows them to overcome antagonism and to converge by becoming different. So I think that this discussion of globalization in the economic realm and the commercial realm is a prelude or accessory to a larger discussion of unity and diversity in the world, which touches on the questions of war and peace. Now that's really all I wanted to say about this momentous topic. Would someone like to make a statement or ask a question? Yes.
So, do you think that this, like, like the separation between will to difference and like, true difference, is kind of the same across different levels? Both, you talked about, like, you did the example of the national level. I'm curious if you think that it extends down further to regional differences within a state, and even like the most extreme version to like differences between two people. Do you think that it's almost self-replicating in that way, or do you think that there's something distinctive about the character of states?
I do think there's something distinctive about not just the character of states, but differences about collectives. I mean, the nation state is not necessarily the only form in which humanity will be divided in the future, right? It's now the predominant form. The main scene of action in the world is the nation state. And that's why in a programmatic discussion like this about the progressive alternatives, the focus is on national politics. I don't think it will necessarily always be that. I think that that the diversity about individuals is of a fundamentally different character. And this is something which I've learned with difficulty in my own experiences of engagement. It's much harder to change a person than it is to change a country. And this is some surprising fact that one should discover in one's experience. It's much easier to change a country than it is to change a person. So we are resistant, right? The individual has secret depths and is resists transformation. To change a country, you only need to be a statesman. To change a person, you need to be a prophet. You need to be Jesus Christ. It's a much higher level of ambition. And it's not something that we're discussing here. So we're discussing the relatively easy topic of the transformation of societies, not the much more difficult topic of the transformation and salvation of individuals. So that's how I would answer your question. Want you the follow-up?
I'm just thinking, considering. I don't know if I'll-
I mean, if you think of it, so say that this process of the transformation of the nation continues in the direction in which I just described, right? They were tribes. Now, in the future, they're becoming forms of moral specialization in humanity. Now, one of the normative consequences of this idea is that if you're born into a nation and you try and change it, but in the end you can't change it, it's a particular form of humanity. You have to be able to escape it. So, and to go somewhere else in the world. So then this principle of this becomes a fundamental right of the human being, the ability to escape the nation into which he was born. And that is another aspect of the transcendent importance of mobility, the ability to cross national frontiers. Otherwise, the nation becomes a prison. So the counterpart to its being a form of moral specialization is that you shouldn't be stuck with it if you despair of transforming it. And you should be able to go somewhere else. And that has to be then part of our conception of human freedom. Do you agree with me?
I'm not sure still. I think to feel confident in saying I agree with you, I need to spend more time thinking about it.
You know, this is this problem that we're discussing. One of its forms is in a conflict among disciplines. So anthropology is not just a social science. Anthropology is the instrument, the agent of a heresy within our Western civilization, right? So the dominant line in anthropology believes that the cultures of the world are the main protagonists in world history and that they have to be preserved. So we have this debate in Brazil. So we give a huge amount of land in the Amazon to the Indian peoples. 21% of the Amazon is reserved to the Indians. But we deny them all of the instruments of economic and educational opportunity. So they're sinking into depression, alcoholism, drug use, and so forth. Dying in their paradises. So what do we have to do? We have to give them access to educational and economic opportunity, but in such a way that the way in which the country gives them access not predetermine the outcome of assimilation or isolation. Because if they collectively choose to be isolated, they should be able to continue. But there's a complication which relates to your question about the individual. So what about the young individual member of the Indian tribe? That person, that boy or girl, is a citizen of the Republic. So if the individual then decides to turn against his tribe, to smash its culture, to rebel against it, the Republic should stand by his side and provide him with the instruments for his action. And that's his right of insubordination, of rebellion. We can imagine that inside a country, but if it's against the country as a whole, the only adequate defense of it is his power to escape the country. So I think that those are the issues on which this touches. But I think and we're going to come back to this in the discussion of the normative assumptions of this whole argument. There's a view of humanity that